Hey,
Hey,
how are you doing?
oh, fine. Reading through the Spark 4.0 PR
Mm.
for Iceberg.
So that'd be a very large one. I haven't checked that.
It's quite large. There's a lot of because they did the Spark Connect thing, there's a bunch of class changes, and I'm not sure we're handling it quite right.
Mm.
So basically, like in order to make Spark Connect a primary thing, they ripped apart the Spark session interface, and now there's like an abstract class and then implementers. And we need to be very careful because some of our APIs use the functionality that isn't present in like the Connect Spark session. So we have to be a little more careful about where that actually gets touched.
Wow. Hi guys.
Hey,
Hey everyone.
It seems like we have a new appearance in the Google meeting. I'm not sure if they have updated that over the last 3 weeks.
We have a new what in the meeting?
Like I mean like the new appearance of like our camera. Like the board is now a little bit nicer than before.
I don't know why I'm in widescreen. Am I in widescreen for everybody?
No, just you.
No.
It's the same
Right.
for me too. Like it's like I got nice little black borders on the top. You get to watch yourself in high def while everybody else.
For me, what made it difference is opening it with Chrome in contrast to Safari.
All in different A/B tests. Feels like.
That's probably right.
Here's the dog.
I just post a docs link in the channel in case.
And Christian, did you want to add the events thing to the discussion? Because I know you just sent out an update.
Yes, I do.
That's probably the biggest topic we have. So
Yeah.
Nice. Let's just give like 1 more minute, and we will get started.
While we're waiting, has anyone else looked into Spark 4 a lot? I'm interested in the Spark session change. That now it's like an abstract class with a classic interface and all that. Anyone
we,
update?
we had a forward port PR that's been hanging out there that we would. I'd really like to get that in, just so that we can track for the changes against 4, because it is pending the release. But is that change recent, or was that?
I think that's one of the structural ones that probably happened a while ago. I'm going through Washin's Spark 4 integration PR.
Yeah.
And there's like a bunch of our functions, which I think just don't work in Spark Connect, which is fine. I just want to make sure I'm interpreting all this correctly.
Yes. I think, so shall we get started? Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining this meeting. This is the first actual like community thing after the summit, and so the only highlight will be a great job. We had a nice summit last week. So encourage everyone to like review the recordings if you're interested in any like talks or presentation that you missed during the summit time. Yeah.
Well, since we're on the summit thing, like there were a couple topics that were brought up, during the summit around REST catalog, and I'd just be interested in if anybody has any comments of things that they heard or features or other things, since we're talking about catalog. General impressions coming out of the conference. The one that I heard was this kind of the scan plan API, and then potentially the fine grained commits, which we went through the effort of getting the spec changes in, but we still don't have a complete reference implementation for. So any other observations or things that you heard from people at the summit? No, nothing.
It's the future,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Times.
Okay.
But I guess like we have we have had also lots of like introduction talks to people like who previously don't know much about the Raft interface, and now like they can get more knowledge of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess like one of the key takeaways that I had was a lot of people are building REST catalog interfaces for all sorts of different applications. So I think we still need to be cautious about like what complexity we introduce, what kind of concepts and things like that, because if we want people to actually support it, if we go and, start adding things all over the place, it could kind of hurt the adoption. And we want to make sure that like the interoperability still remains as kind of the primary focus. And, we incrementally refine that. But I don't want to obviously say that like there's no room for adding new things like the event stuff and everything like that. I think it's just a matter of making sure that we understand like how many people are actually like implementing this thing at this time. And so I think it's good to keep that in mind. Okay.
So let's move to the next topic, which is the drop namespace behavior and the requirement for dropping all tables. I don't know who put that there. So
Yeah, so I
please
put
feel free
that
to-
over there. Hi folks, this is Maninder. So what I'm observing is that like in our spec, we have this requirement that if we want to drop a namespace, we only allow the drop of namespace if all the tables underneath the namespace, they are dropped. But there is a difference in implementation for some of the catalogs. For example, like certain catalogs like Glue, they allow you to drop the namespace without, even if you have tables. Other catalogs, say like Polaris, they actually say, we don't allow namespace drop if there are some tables underneath. I wanted to understand like why do we have this requirement for dropping all the tables before we can drop the namespace? Like what is the historical reason for this? And is there an option where maybe in future we can allow both the behaviors as valid, maybe by passing in some options? Like one place where I kind of find this annoying is like if I have created a namespace with bunch of tables. Now, if I'm writing a SQL, I need to list all the tables and then drop them one by one before I can drop that namespace?
So I think the spec says currently the namespace must be empty. I don't think that there's necessarily going to be any problem if an implementation just drops it. Like if Glue, and Glue probably does this right now, right? Does it actually have a check that ensures that it's empty, or does it actually just drop?
It just drops.
Yeah. So I think the spec was probably based on some of the existing catalog implementations that were out there where, you know, we couldn't allow you to drop in some cases because it wasn't empty. And so we chose to enumerate like, well, what should the response be if it isn't empty, and send that back. But I'm not sure that there's anything that actually relies on you failing if there are tables under there. So it's one of those things where I would expect a catalog that does allow dropping of tables under a namespace if you drop, just to have that in their documentation, and you just allow the request to succeed. I don't think that that's like something that I would consider a major spec violation. Okay, we've got a couple comments. Edward, did you have something, or did you?
No, I essentially just wanted to say what you said. Like essentially from the supports namespaces APIs where we define at the API level what the behavior should be. And it says like if the namespace isn't empty, we specifically throw a namespace not empty exception. And that's what we expect from catalogs. And that's what we also added to the REST spec. But as you said, then like catalog implementation can choose and document if they change their behavior.
Yeah, we actually have a similar thing in one of the catalog implementations where if you create a table and the namespace doesn't exist, it automatically creates it. And, you know, like we could get really, you know, complicated in defining all the behaviors of namespaces and everything else. And like, hey, if you try and create something that a namespace doesn't exist, like, you know, that's against the spec. But these things largely, I don't think have a huge impact on clients, right? A client is either going to get an error that says, hey, you can't create that because the namespace doesn't exist, or it's going to get an error saying you can't drop that because there are things in it. But that's, I mean, that's kind of a human interaction. So unless there's like tools that depend on this functionality and we're, you know, creating a problem for the ecosystem, like I would almost say that it's not worth complicating things by adding parameters and forcing people to be able to drop if a parameter is set or something like that.
Yeah, like one area where this gets a bit complicated is that, let's say if you're doing some sort of testing or whatever, the client has created a namespace and few tables. Now, let's say at the end of a failure, now the client needs to be aware that so many tables were created and drop them rather than just dropping the entire namespace. If I look at some of the database implementations, this feel a bit weird for the clients, where usually they can say, you know, just drop the schema or drop the database. Usually they don't have to worry about how many tables are underneath a schema or a database.
Yeah,
I would say, while like the sentiment I generally would agree with, even especially if this were early in the project, it does seem a little bit risky to allow that change in behavior. Now, okay, the fact that some catalogs already don't adhere to that part of the spec is interesting, because ultimately, like this is the difference between, you know, RM versus RM-R, right? And like even the other day, I was noticing that, okay, there was a test that created like tens of thousands of it created namespace every time it ran, deleted the tables, but it forgot to delete the namespaces, and we have all these things lying around. I was like, well, great. It's nice that we won't accidentally delete anything that still has tables in it. I could just go and drop namespace on every single namespace, call it drop namespace, and I'm safe. I'm safe from accidentally deleting data because of the spec change, or because of the spec. And this is actually ingrained, like the fact that the no such namespace exception exists. does come up. So it is at least plausible. Like even in my day-to-day, I was like, I'm safe to clean things up in my known catalog. So like at least given an existing catalog, it mustn't change its behavior, right? I think in like written documentation about that behavior is better than nothing. But in this case, I mean, like it does seem like there's enough precedent, like a dash recursive flag, right? Like I think that way, you know, like 'cause sometimes you do want to just blow away the whole namespace, and maybe like the catalog can efficiently do that by just unlinking the the namespace in a way that makes all the children go away. So it's recursive doesn't necessarily have to mean it's going through deleting everything one by one, but knowing, understanding that does add more complexity, like we were just talking about trying to avoid complexity. But I mean, I think this one might be one that is worth expressing, whether you're trying to do a recursive delete.
Yeah. And then the catalogs can choose what their default behavior is. But in my mind, like we should still allow at least to express it within the spec, both the behaviors.
Yeah, so like maybe from my side, I do see value in kind of standardizing this, because I fear like implementations not being compatible anymore if we leave this up to the catalog. And I think like maybe a recursive or a cascade behavior is something that is standardized in databases, which is why I think it would also make sense to standardize the behavior here. With our catalog, we actually introduced the recursive flag exactly for this reason. And also fail because we want to have secure defaults, right? We don't want to do an RM minus RF if the user isn't absolutely sure that he wants this. So I guess the question here is, like, do we gain something if we add an additional flag? My feeling is yes, because I think this is something that deserves to be standardized and is common behavior also in databases. So I guess the question is, should we add a cascade or recursive flag, something along those lines, which would allow exactly this behavior?
So I was just looking at what support was out there, and it looks like that concept does exist in a number of the open source engines, at least like the drop database, drop schema, either cascade or restrict. If we have ANSI, I mean, if that is something in ANSI, I think it would be a much better justification for saying, hey, well, we should at least be able to represent what is in, the ANSI, defined behaviors for this. I don't know if they go to that level of detail or if that's kind of engine specific. I was just checking to see what Trino says.
Yeah, also like cascade and restrict, we need to be sure, because sometimes they refer to the constraints that could be dependent on other objects, like other databases. It might not mean recursive, because usually in my experience, the database is, when we say drop database, usually it is a recursive drop for everything underneath.
So I think then the question is, are you saying what the default behavior is your concern?
So I'm not sure if we can change the default at this point, because it would be a breaking change. But at least we should allow expressing the recursive drop. That way, some of the catalogs can say that my default behavior is this versus that. But having it expressible in the spec with clarity would be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, we could say that the implementations pick their own default, but we kind of have to avoid the breaking change. So if implementations retain their existing behavior, yeah,
We don't care about Hive not implementing the REST spec as it's currently defined. Or Glue, yeah.
Yeah, that raises an interesting point, though. Is in the spec, would we at least want to say, though, like if the caller provides the option that's not supported, that the implementation should throw an error? That will be extra work, and actually in the meantime, it means like if people don't update their implementation quickly enough, the way they'll be out of spec is by ignoring the option, which is annoying in one direction and dangerous in the other direction. So
So Dennis, could that be expressed as a bad request if they don't support?
yeah,
it?
or not. I mean, there are I mean, there's standard. I don't think it's bad request, but it's like an unsupported operation, right? Because conceptually, they're two different types of actions that you're trying to express.
So I guess like we mostly agree that this would be something worth looking into. So I guess I'm not sure, Amanda, we don't have a proposal right now, a concrete proposal, right? We have a discussion on the mailing list. So maybe it makes sense to formulate a proposal from that now, including those nitty-gritty details that we were just talking about, and then discussing it in the next thing again.
Sounds good.
Great. So shall we like move to the next one, which is the events endpoint? Christian, you have already provided an update in the mailing list. So
yeah, so yeah, I mean, after the discussion last time, I made a few changes to it that, well, I think mainly we discussed. I already got a little bit of feedback. I think also Ryan had a look at it. I think the biggest open point right now is regarding the users array. What we want to do with that, because this is a new concept that the event endpoint introduces, right? Basically being able to filter by users. Although of course it's optional, right? So if a catalog maybe has no concept of users, specifying a user filter won't do anything. But the question is, should we introduce it, and should we introduce this concept in the way that we currently did, basically just as a set of strings? Yeah, Ryan was also commenting if we should make this generic. I guess that's one point of discussion.
Yeah, I think to that point, I think his comment and what he mentioned was basically we shouldn't be introducing new catalog concepts here. And so we don't have any concept of user, right? And so introducing it through this would be somewhat awkward because we haven't really defined what that means. There may be, different, that's one of those things we kind of explicitly avoided. Like even ownership is something that we explicitly avoided because of some of the differences of implementations and complexity that introduces. And we're just allowing catalogs and their authorization approaches to kind of surround the functionality with whatever their construct is. So that's where I think if we can make this generic in a way that hey, if you do support that, extra fields, extra entries, you can produce those as part of the events, right? It doesn't need to be part of the spec. And that's true for a lot of the endpoints. If you want to return extra values, they're ignored. So I think the question is we want to leave opportunity for people to provide additional information where it's meaningful, but not have to force everything into the spec in some way.
Yeah.
So I think that then the question is, well, what does that mean for filtering, right?
What does it mean for filtering? Yeah. So, yeah, Alex, maybe you can bring up your point because that would be one alternative.
Sorry, yeah. So in Nessie, we have this expression language called Cell, which is derived from a Google language initially. I don't remember actually. It means common expression language. And basically, you can define very simple expressions like I want user to be equal to this and whatever the request path to be equal to that. And then it's compiled server side, and it becomes an expression that you can apply to the iterator or whatever you are retrieving from the database.
Yeah. So that could be one option. I'm not sure if other options could be, just adding a filter like key values. I want this key to be in this set of values, something like that. I also thought about when writing this point about introducing CL, opted against it back then because it can introduce arbitrary filter complexity. So it's really hard to limit. And it's also not, I know it's well defined, but it would also be a new concept that we added here. but it could, I mean, the server could also refuse too complex queries. I just thought that having, a static set of filters makes it much easier also for the catalogs to know what to expect and index on that.
Yeah, I think my general concern would be we currently don't have any dependencies from the REST spec on any particular external implementation of anything, right? So why take on that dependency?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that like a server couldn't support an extra parameter that somebody, provides that has cell, but like I don't think we would want to bake that into the spec.
Yeah. Okay. What's stopping us from introducing a user concept? Basically, as a user ID?
That's loaded. Like, I mean, just there's systems that don't think in terms of users, right? I think the more we add those constructs, the more it's gonna like, well, hey, what about the user for a table? Like, what are we passing back as far as a user, right? Is there an ownership concept? Who owns something? Is there a role? Do we need to introduce role too? Or is it groups? So once you get into that identity domain, there's a lot of things that like you pull on that thread and it gets very complicated.
Yeah. Groups would be a good point, yeah. I mean, with the current filter, what we basically would have to agree on is that we can identify a user via a string, but even that doesn't hold true like always, yeah. So, okay, so I'll change that. I'll think about it. I'll try to. It's probably going to be, some kind of hash map string something that we introduce for it to be a little bit more generic. If any of you have some like concrete ideas, feel free to comment in the document, then I can take that into account. Okay. There is one other small comment that came up, or that actually Ryan just added. And that is, should the transaction ID be required or not? I know it's a nit, but nonetheless, we need to have a decision. Yeah, currently it is required. Ryan's comments was that maybe, this should also be optional in case the implementation doesn't create a transaction ID. My point there is that, like, we do have the concept of a transaction in the REST spec. Like every time we change something, we provide changes. So wouldn't even in those cases implementations be able to, generate a UUID or something as part of a transaction?
Well, at that point, though, you're basically like making up an ID, right? So
Exactly.
what would an implementation that doesn't actually like have any real concept of tracking this, like, oh, I just use UUID.ran, like, how is that helpful as opposed to saying it's optional and then like I actually don't have transaction IDs. Like this is just the event stream.
The thing that the client loses the ability to group transactions together, right? That appear naturally. And so the only thing that a server would need to make sure of is that whatever it returns there, and it can be a random string that is made up, is not returned twice for two different transactions. Yeah, the grouping would break otherwise, right? So we couldn't assign everything that happened in one transaction before.
I'm concerned about that because it feels like it adds a lot of complexity to do right. Because a lot of systems, they don't expose transactions in any way up to that level, right? So like even if you're thinking about like, wrapping a Hive metastore in a REST catalog for, just being able to like move your infrastructure over, like you don't have any insight into that. And you would have to do a bunch of extra logic to make sure that you're capturing transaction IDs appropriately and producing them. I don't know. I think we probably need to think about that more.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's either going to end up in like one of two camps. One is like everybody has to do a bunch of work to do it right, or everybody just produces UIDs. and they don't even track it or key, you know, like.
But everybody just producing UIDs is perfectly fine in this case, right? So you get a bunch of changes, you generate the events from it in one batch, like in one request, you assign this ID, you're done, right?
But what if, you know, people are assigning these IDs, but like they're actually part of a transaction? So you're saying things are not, that they're distinct, but they were actually part. It just, you kind of lose that fidelity, right? And then at what point, like, does it not mean anything? So, I don't know. I think it's just something to think about. I don't know that I have a strong opinion. I can easily see going the other way. So.
Okay. Do we have more opinions here?
I'm a little lost here. So if it's not required, don't we have all the same problem? Like I mean, required just seems like if it's required and we generate random UUIDs, that sounds pretty good to me. Because optional and none, I don't know what that gets us there. Like the hard case of like actually having a server-side tracking of the transactions is just as hard, but we also don't get what could be like a minimally useful like thing that we could use on the client side. So I'm just kind of, that's where I'm kind of stuck.
I would think the difference would be if it's optional and I produce it, I'm probably doing the right thing. I'm providing you real transaction fidelity. And if I'm not producing it, it's probably because either I can't really do that, or for some reason I don't want to. As opposed to feeding you just like information that you then have to guess at whether it's correct or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my point, I guess, was that it's easy enough to produce, similar to what Russell said. But okay, let's think about this one step further.
I mean, is what you're looking for really an event ID as opposed to a transaction ID, just to be able to deduplicate events so that you know that you haven't duplicated?
We do have an event ID in there now, right?
Okay.
We didn't have in the first version. We do have it in there now because I think we need a primary key, right? And since I was getting rid of this awesome concept of a sequence number, we now have like this new concept of event ID. The main purpose of the transaction ID is just to identify like all the changes that happened, you know, in one post request to the server. That's all there is. I was actually thinking about returning one row per transaction first, you know, and just add, you know, return a vector of events basically, but decided that a flatter structure is beneficial because you can filter it much better, right? It's much clearer how filters are applied, and well, it's also easier usable by clients because they don't have, you know, to iterate through different events of different kinds, but they have them just listed one after the other. But that introduced the challenge that, you know, we do have a number of changes that belong together. And I mean, in the commit endpoint, we even have special semantics there with -1s that we pass around and other kinds of proxy values that we might to remove eventually. And yeah, and that's why I introduced the transaction ID instead.
So yeah, I mean, now I think I'm more in favor of doing like UUID approach, because it sounds like we aren't actually trying to identify transactions as saying that the server can optionally identify certain events that happened at the same time in its context. And if it can't, then issuing a different one for every event would also be acceptable, right? Because that would just be an expression of what the server actually is doing as well. Is that right? Like we're essentially a grouping of events to a certain identifier, okay. And either the catalog can do that or it can't, and the client can understand either way.
Let's go back to the example that we had of the drop namespace, because if we had drop namespace with Cascade, you could see either the catalog producing a whole bunch of table drop events, all with the same transaction ID, and that would probably indicate that they did that as part of a transaction, right? Or as part of an operation, but they could also produce unique IDs for each one of those drop events. So like, where do we fall? There's like 3 different options there, which is either they actually do a transaction, they provide a transaction ID. They don't do a transaction, but they produce a transaction ID. that shows that all of those things were part of the same request, in which case we're kind of misnamed. This is now a request ID, or like, a response ID or something like that. Yeah, batch ID, something that coordinates those things. Or the last one where it's like, I'm just producing a bunch of random events and it's no different than if I called it, delete every single time or drop. What are we looking for? Like, what behavior? Like, I think what you're saying, Christian, is like, you really want that first one, right? Like that it's a transaction that we can show all of that happened at once. But I'm not sure we can guarantee every implementation can actually do that operation as a transaction.
Yeah, I see that point, but currently, I mean, all the endpoints that we have in the catalog, like they require or should require a transaction. But I guess like if a catalog decides to have a more complex request handled in multiple transactions, it would be fine to return like multiple request IDs there, just as Russell said. And if you have 3 table operations and you can't even handle those in parallel, then it's perfectly fine to just add 3 different IDs there to say that these were not handled at the same time by the server. And then regarding the recursive namespace drop, right, it might fail halfway through if it's not in one transaction. Well, then you miss the first events.
There's only 2 endpoints that actually require a transaction, and that is the table level commit and the transaction level commit. Those are the only 2 that actually.
And maybe we'll see what the purge, right? Or a cascade delete. Yeah. So it would be fine to return multiple IDs there, I guess.
I think like what we want to get at is like, what behavior do we want? Do we really want the transaction level like grouping? Do we want the request level grouping? Or because like you could argue, hey, maybe transaction ID is the wrong name. It's actually like, the batch ID or the request ID, response ID, however we want to describe that.
So with what we just said, I think transaction ID is the most correct thing, even though I haven't thought about that before. Because if we would have added a request ID there, it would require, basically a full transaction compatibility to work. While if we leave it with transaction ID, and we maybe describe the notion of what we mean by that a little bit more, we would have the option to, if partial request was executed because the system is not capable of doing it all in a single transaction, then this can be emitted, and the client knows something happened.
Well, so like the issue that I run into there is like what it sounds like what we're really trying to get at is, hey, when I performed an operation, when I made a request to the catalog, all of these corresponding events correlate to that request.
Yeah.
Right. Not necessarily a transaction. It would actually be difficult for me because if I did the drop namespace with Cascade and the backend catalog does not support that within a transaction and goes through and it drops each table individually, how do I correlate those back to the original request that I made? I can't.
Yeah, so basically you're thinking about request ID header, passing it through, basically.
And conceptually, you could even say that like, hey, when I issue a request, you could send back, a header or something like that with the, the request ID that you could then correlate
exactly,
to events eventually, something like that. But now we're talking request scope, not like transaction, which actually is more of an implementation detail of the backend.
For me, one request is always a transaction. I guess like those catalogs have to chime in for which this is not the case.
I mean, you could imagine you have something
having back the request ID there, being able to correlate events to requests. That makes sense. That's a nice feature.
Hive cannot do this as part of a transaction.
I mean, purge table drop is almost, or drop table purge is almost never going to be, well, not just all, but like that's not going to be transactional on cleanup of the underlying files, right? And if we wanted an event that signals the subsequent cleanup, then that would be part of this. It's associated with the drop table purge request, but not transactional.
Yeah.
I mean, I would mostly be considering catalog state and not like file system state, because like essentially those files aren't part of the moment we do the metadata change, those files aren't really part of the system anymore.
Which is a big problem, right? They're orphaned now. But
yeah, but that's an implementation detail for cleanup, I think. Like as a client, I don't know if that event really is something that is useful to me. Like
yeah, I mean, we
catalog.
also for drop, I mean, we just purge metadata immediately, add the table to a queue. It's going to be cleaned up later.
But then, like the later queue, because like in Polaris, for example, it's portrayed as enqueuing a task transactionally, or possibly a series of tasks transactionally, right? And then those tasks represent what happens later for cleanup. And we could, I guess, okay, in this case, since that's outside of the Iceberg REST model, I don't know if that means like we wouldn't put that in events API, or are there custom event types per catalog that would become part of, that would be added to events API? I don't know.
Custom events, that's actually a good point. Do we want that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's nothing that's going to stop people from producing events if they want to. So, like, I think we define what the standards are. I don't think that we should necessarily go to the extent of saying you cannot produce anything but these events.
Yeah.
I think, Dennis, for that case, only the request identifier would like make sense. Like there's no transactional state with the file removal, but there is a request that is tied to it.
Yeah.
And in a way, this means that, you know, they're orthogonal. Like you can express both. There's request IDs and there's transaction IDs. Some things may or may not have a transaction ID, and then request IDs may or may not be transactional. Like they shouldn't be thought of as implying one transaction.
I mean, does that sound like a compromise, Christian? We have optional transaction ID required requests.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm also on board with just request ID. The question is, do we want the transaction ID on top? For me, this is always the same. Do we need the additional transaction ID? For me, I'm fine with just request ID. I would then also like expand it a little bit to actually return it, so that we have, yeah. So.
Oh, for the responses, yeah. I question that. Going through and enumerating all of the mutating endpoints to now return a request ID. And then like, okay, that would by definition it would have to be optional because it impacts the existing clients.
I mean, we can also like not return it, and if the client wants to do that correlation, just require the client to set the header. It's just, yeah.
Yeah. Well, a client should never define the ID, right?
Potentially. I mean, it could actually be useful for idempotent requests as well.
I don't think so. That should be handled separately, but a client should never define the request ID because it just it adds onus onto the server. Like, what if the client keeps setting the same request ID? Well, that shouldn't be allowed. But now as a server, I have to track all the IDs for some period of time to make sure that they're not duplicate. Like, it shouldn't be done.
Yeah. So it needs to be returned, but it needs to be optional.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, we can propose that and see if there's pushback. Like, I'm not like opposed to it. It's just like all the change, you know, is involved in.
I'll try to write it. We'll see how many lines of changes it is, and then we can decide it.
Yeah, I just don't know how many endpoints that really affects. Because like most things, like, would you want a request ID for all of the non-mutating endpoints, right? Or is it just mutating endpoints?
So yeah, I guess mutating endpoints for now in the return. Yeah.
That's a smaller subset, and then maybe people will care about the other endpoints.
Exactly, yeah. Nice, okay. Do you have any other comments from this round? I'm not sure. I hope I addressed all comments, but I'm not 100% sure. Otherwise, if more comes up, just add it to the document. I'll work on another revision then, including request IDs and a lot of return values, optional ones, and then I'll send another mail.
Sounds great. Thanks for the discussion on the event listener. So it seems like we will end up with some like a little bit large changes. Hopefully that can go through. Okay. The next topic would be the disable client-side purge with a PR link. If anyone wants to like chime in to discuss more
Yeah,
about
I
that?
can do that. I just added it to the link to the list here because it's kind of a little bit stall, and I'm not really sure what to do about it, but it's very important in my mind. So let me maybe introduce a little bit on why we have a problem. And I think we talked about this in the December sync already. Russell left a really good summary in his last comment on January 21st on where we ended up. So let me maybe summarize that really quickly. So currently we have a problem that if a client runs, if with Spark or execute a drop table something purge, then client actually purges away all the files and then tells the server not that much about it. And this is like quite problematic for REST implementations. So we have like a lot of implementations just setting S3 dot like enable delete or disable delete flag to tell clients to never delete any files, which works, I guess, okay for drop table purge, but which breaks like if you just expire snapshots, you expire the snapshots, but files still fly around. So it's very bad. So the idea was to introduce a new flag. So first of all, we agreed in January that this behavior should change. Like for REST catalog implementation, the correct behavior for the client is to not remove any files and just tell the server about it, that the purge flag was set. So that's what we agreed on. However, we also said we can't change this right now in Iceberg because this would be a breaking change if we change the Spark behavior right now. So we can basically only do it when we ever get to Iceberg 2 or something. But we need a solution in the meantime. And so the idea was that we might want to add an additional flag that says client-side purge disabled, which then only affects purge, right? But clients would still delete files if they expire snapshots. And there was a PR, the PR I linked. And I guess like the main discussion point, Ryan also commented on that. And that's the main question I wanted to discuss today is, should this be a REST catalog flag or should this be a general flag? So we implemented it as a REST catalog flag, but Ryan commented that it should be, a general flag for tables, for Iceberg tables. And yeah, I guess the question is how do we proceed? Not sure if we can find an answer now. I just wanted to get a little bit of attention on the topic.
Yeah, I wanted to talk with Ryan about that one. I still think it should be REST catalog only for this flag. We're trying to do a temporary solution, so let's not overthink the behavior for everyone else, because I don't think we even have a sensible implementation for FLN client plugins. Like a lot of our catalog plugins have no way of drop table purging regardless. Like the JDBC one cannot drop table purge. So I would like to scope it just to REST catalog. I want to mark this flag with deprecated in 2.0 the moment we put it in and be like, we're changing the behavior. I think that's where we were. It's been a while since January.
I think maybe what Ryan was probably thinking about was that if we were going to make this a property that clients respond to and comes from the catalog, whether it's a plugin implementation or not, at least it's explicit about what the client behavior should be. So like a Hive client or a JDBC client would actually just say, yeah, client-side purge enable to tell the clients that they should be cleaning things up. Whereas a REST one could then optionally, or any implementation that has some sort of background functionality would be telling the client, like, don't clean up files because we're managing them for you in some way. I think it makes the most sense in context of REST, because those are the ones that actually have implementations behind it to do that active management.
Yeah, since this is manual here, though, I don't I don't know. I still see this as kind of our workaround PR. So I don't know if we have to like go down that route. Like I think I'm okay with Hive behaving the way it does right now, and basically everything behaving the way it does right now, with an option for users of a system that is going to do better REST client side purging to delegate. But I don't think the catalog can let you know yet. Like I think it has to be a parameter that we're setting, the client setting, right? Like.
Well, the tables in most implementations are created based off the catalog properties, right? So wouldn't we just pass it through as part of the catalog, or the table create from the catalog implementation? So you could argue that something like, S3 tables or something like that, I don't know what they do for management, but they may not have a REST implementation, but they may also want to signal similarly. And so then, like, if we make it REST specific and eventually have to add it as a general table property.
Do you think we'll have to make it a general table property? That's my. I don't know. I don't care about the other catalog plugins now.
Yeah, I know, but like, does it hurt to make it a table property that is the default is what all the other catalog behaviors would be, which is just do the purge yourself? So I think that's the argument. I'm not like actually sure which side I end up on right now.
So my huge worry all the time with table properties is that people with random credentials can change them for everybody else, and I don't like doing that.
Only in other catalogs, right? Like the REST catalog can protect that.
Yes, the REST catalog can, but no other ones can, and those are the ones we're gonna be trying to fix this for. So I don't know.
I don't think fixing that problem for the other catalogs is necessary, right?
Yeah. I don't. Can we just move forward with this one as is? I think these are all reasonable discussions, but I don't know if we're going to add any specific value to doing that right now. And I think it'd be nice to go forward with what we have.
So is this, I guess, I haven't actually looked at the PR, but just to help understand what the flow is here, is this a property we send back as part of the load table response config?
It's just the client, like it's a Spark configuration property. You're allowed to set a catalog, it's a catalog property.
Right, but like, so the REST catalog would be telling clients, hey, don't purge. Like even if somebody says purge, don't do it, right?
So the client can, like, I think me as a server, I would put it in the defaults, right? So I would send it to the client, tell it to not do it, but then a client can decide to override it by just setting, Spark property.catalog.purge enabled. True. So the catalog sets the default, but the client can override. And the catalog sets the default only on the /config endpoint, not on all the others. And this way, I mean, also, if a catalog doesn't have this delete logic, implemented, it can still tell the client to go ahead and delete this, and we don't have to, like, I'm also very much in favor of REST catalog property, because this way we don't have to, distribute it into every single table out there, how we want to treat this individual table. I think this is more of a system-wide configuration.
Yeah, so when I look at it, like the actual implementation would respect this regardless of whether it comes from the REST catalog or not. So the only thing is the property itself is calling out the implementation, which is a little weird. Why don't we just drop the REST, make it general, and you can use it from the REST catalog. But you could also set it as catalog defaults for any other catalog implementation.
Yeah.
I think that's...
My worry is that it has zero chance of working for almost all of our other implementations.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what I don't like about that. Like, at least with REST, there is a potential that this is what you actually intend to do. And then for others, like, Yeah, you set this for JDBC catalog. We have no way of actually saying, like, guess what? You just did absolutely nothing. That's why I'm saying, like, this is like my workaround.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe let's put some more eyes on this. I hope that we can go on with this soon, because this is really a pain currently, and you have to tell users about like how it behaves, and you have to explain them to, I don't know how many people I sent this link and telling them, sorry, you have to configure like 2 different cases differently. So yeah, maybe just a few more eyes on this, and then maybe we get it through. Otherwise, I'll bring it up in the next catalog sync again.
We'll follow up. Like I need to think about it just a little bit more. And I don't know if Ryan's comments were just a quick pass, but I'm not opposed to it. It's just the property. Do we scope it to REST catalog? Is that necessary? So
good.
Cool. We have 45 minutes left, so let's go to the last one, which is the behavior of the snapshots reference relative to other snapshots field.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I put this one on there. I can keep it quick. I think one thing is I just wanted to see if anybody knew like the current state of how standardized using the snapshots equals refs trimming functionality is in different client libraries. Like I don't know, I don't see it getting sent from Spark, but maybe I'm mostly testing with older Spark clients. But also secondly, it's clear that there's a big problem for fast moving tables that retain a lot of snapshots. Like that might be a problem in itself, like that if people are that aren't configuring expiration properly. But suppose you have a really huge metadata JSON. There's a couple of other fields that still grow with the size of snapshots. That's like the metadata log and the snapshot log. So technically the spec says, okay, only like in the main snapshots array, presumably you'll just return the refs, which is in 99% of cases just main. So you just return literally one snapshot. Is there any resistance? Like it seems like it's also natural to trim or just remove a metadata log and snapshot log or anything else that also grows with num snapshots from the returned response.
I know there were attempts, I forgot the name from who, to introduce a more lazy behavior into loading those fields. I don't know the current status. Like I haven't heard back the last couple of months.
that gets really complicated for those. I think trimming them. I mean, there are optional fields. I thought we had some properties to define like how many to keep. So some of this is configured, and maybe what you're the lack of what you're seeing is the catalog can return the default behavior for refs and snapshots, right? So if your catalog turns that on, all requests will come through as refs only unless they actually need the full behavior. So
the Spark, and this is just my ignorance of the Spark client. Like the Spark client, is it smart enough to know that like when it's doing a time travel query, it better ask for all of them, but when it's not doing a time travel query, it can just use the default snapshot equals refs?
No.
Okay.
It'll trigger. What'll happen is it'll do the load and then it'll trigger the full snapshot load.
Okay. It is something that the catalog would more likely control. The catalog would tell you, oh, for optimizations for this table or for all tables, you always return only the one single reference, and whenever you whenever you load all of the snapshots through the table metadata API, it will automatically fetch all of the remaining ones.
Okay, interesting. So the client side is not cooperative. Like a single client doesn't get to choose.
It's not smart right now. It's basically if you need to refer to other snapshots, it'll go load them. So, but the client isn't like actively saying, "Hey, I'm doing time travel, so I'm going to make this request versus another." It's a byproduct of trying to access older snapshots.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
That triggers the complete load.
Oh.
So I guess, so there's a question about how do we trim these other logs? Is it about how do we trigger snapshot ref loading? Like what are we actually trying to?
It was two questions. Yeah. So the first one, maybe I just need to dig into the code. The second one, it sounds like we're just allowed to trim as we see fit.
They're optional. Yeah, I would say trim. And like, I would almost propose at some point we might want to get rid of the metadata log because it's basically not used by anything. So I think you're pretty safe in trimming that to your heart's content. The other ones, like the actual snapshot log and other things, like, I mean, obviously that, you know, is related to cleanup and retention and maintenance and other things like that. But, you know, it's behind a catalog implementation, I think we expect that they're kind of fully managed. And so whatever the catalog is doing for cleanup, maintenance, whatever else is the result of what you get back from the metadata, right?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey,
I think
thanks,
what you're
guys.
going to run into is more of like the usability conflict of like, hey, if you're returning too little and people are relying on it, they're going to complain and they're going to want some way to extend that. I don't think it's a technical limitation in any way. Like, you know, a managed table, you know, it can do snapshot cleanup behind the scenes. It could, you know, it could curtail that log and do it aggressively or defer that work later, even if it removes the snapshots. I think that there's a lot of flexibility that can be done there. It's just more about like the client needs the information to do the things that it needs. And if, you know, you're not providing the history, like people are going to complain that like, hey, you know, why don't I have snapshots? So the catalog just needs to facilitate those use cases.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're a little bit over time, so I will just call a stop here. Thanks everyone for joining this meeting. I will send the recording very soon after, maybe by today or by tomorrow. Thanks.
You guys.
Thanks, everyone.